Hello, welcome everybody. One of the last sessions of the day. Ooh,
That's not a good start, is it?
good start. You're still connected, so that's going good.
Connected.
So here we are. My name is Miguel Neves. I'm the editor-in-chief of Skift Meetings, and we're just getting set up on stage. And while we do that, if you're here to talk about or hear about budgets, you're in the right place. Hopefully we have an interesting conversation for you. Who's heard of Skift or Skift Meetings? Can I get a show of hands? I have a lot of work to do in this room. Great. Lots of work there. So we're here to be talking about achieving more with less, strategies for high-impact events on a budget. And we're talking about rising costs, stagnant budgets, cost of living crisis, geopolitics. We're going to need a little bit more than half an hour maybe, but we're going to try to go through it quickly. Of course, there's also the changes of COVID to business world in general. And of course, in the middle of all this, clients still want to organize high-impact events, keeping costs under control. Easy, right? Like you've got everything worked out, right?
Day of all days, right?
Exactly. And AI is probably not going to solve this, at least for now. It's not like the magic solution. So let me introduce our panel, two experts that deal with this all the time, and we're here to find out how they do it, and hopefully that'll be interesting for you. Claire, I'll start with that side. Claire Melton, the interim event manager at Advent International, previously the executive director, global head of enterprise events at S&P Global. Thank you for joining us. And Jane Baker, founder of Rise at 5, and also head of international marketing for Headspace. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Let's jump in. I want to just get a raise of hands in the audience. Who is a planner or organizer in the audience? Can I just get a raise of hands? Okay, so most, probably 60, 70%. And who's on the corporate side? So corporate, kind of end user, planner.
Yeah.
Okay, half of that. And on the agency side? Okay, a few. So I want to start with you, Claire. I think the first thing you said to me when I asked you to be part of this session was really to actually make this distinction about how we look at budgets from a corporate side or from an agency side. Can you expand a little bit on that distinction?
Absolutely. So I think for me, from a corporate perspective, we are set our budgets at the beginning of every year, and that is what we have to play with. Now, we do work with agencies, and so we have to work in partnership with the agencies to make sure that those budgets are well house kept, if you like, and that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're spending and, crucially, who's responsible for what. We have our event budgets and they're not necessarily the agency's budgets, because I may have to do things with that budget that the agency doesn't necessarily have visibility of, depending on the partnership. And I'm 100% accountable for that budget. So I am responsible at the end of the year or at the end of the budget, the reconciliation process, to demonstrate the return effectively. The events that we run wouldn't necessarily show a return on investment, because we all know in this room that it's very difficult to track ROI in its truest sense against events. But I have to show a return in some way. And so for me, from a corporate perspective, being able to demonstrate the value of that budget and how I've achieved value from it is really important.
Interesting. Jane, you kind of wear two hats. So even in the introduction, you have these two hats. So I want you to kind of explain to us, first of all, is that how you see it as well, and how you look at budgets with these two different hats?
Yeah, it's actually very similar. I think having, being agency side, being corporate side, budgets are set. There are some flexibilities within those budgets at certain times. But I think, throughout my career, I've always had this kind of mantra of spend it like it's yours in terms of budgets. And I've always found it really helpful to take specific line items on budgets and turn them into real things. I've run some pretty big budgets in the past. You can have line items that are generous six figures for what might seem to be quite, not necessarily hugely valuable things. Signage, temp staff, all of these different component parts. And you look at them and you're like, you could buy houses for that. You could buy whole cars, multiple cars for that. It's a lot of money. And sometimes when you're dealing with those kind of things, you can become a little bit blasé in places about it where you're like, small overspend here, a few £100, small overspend there, a few £1,000. This stuff all adds up. So, yeah, I think it's really important to work in partnership, as you talked about. I think sometimes, having been on the agency side as well, when you're not privy to some of the information, you don't necessarily know how best to guide your clients. So I found some of the most effective partnerships have been where we've really shared strategic objectives and understanding so that we can make recommendations. Actually, we're underspending here, and could that be reallocated there? Do you need it somewhere else? How can you be smart with it? You can get more out of this. Actually, don't need that. Do that instead. And start to become a more kind of strategic advisor where money's concerned.
Okay.
But look after the pennies.
You mentioned flexibility. Can you dive into that a little bit more? What does that mean? Does that mean, like, I know I can save a little bit here and I'm going to put it on that line item? Is that more of a communication with the client? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, all the way through the supply chain, you start with clients that have their budget. That comes from a client that pays them somewhere, right? Money doesn't grow on, there is no magic money tree, right? Politicians will tell you differently, but it doesn't grow on trees. So I think we all know that through that supply chain, there are no charities. Everybody needs to earn enough money to cover their costs and to pay their teams.
Yep.
So I think it's around finding ways to work together that tick the boxes for everybody on that way through. You don't want to cut things that impact an ability to make enough money to cover the project, because you don't get the right service, you don't get the right support in the line of people that supplier wants to help. You're not number one, and you need to be number one.
Yep.
So I think there's just ways of managing the partnership of that level of transparency, that level of openness,
Yep.
And that level of flexibility. And when you build that relationship with a client, I think it comes back.
Absolutely. And I would say as well, to understand the value of what you're spending on what. So we were talking about, being able to look at really big numbers and sometimes lose the perspective on what those numbers look like. So especially when you're looking at big budgets, but not even with big budgets, just with budgets generally, have a really good understanding from an industry perspective of actually what's a reasonable price to pay for something, and know, regardless of whether you're looking at a £5,000 budget for an event or a £5 million budget for an event, is what I'm spending on flowers actually a proportionate amount to be spending, or on catering? What does that look like in terms of value for money? Because it's only once you start digging into the value for money per line item, I think, that you get a real understanding of whether you're spending your money in the right direction. And that's something that, working in partnership with agencies who do this for a number of different clients, are able to guide on as well.
Yeah.
Now, sticking with the flexibility side, but a lot of agencies will have quite large budgets. We'll be managing different parts of events.
Yeah.
How flexible can they be with these budgets, in your mind, Claire? I mean, can they move things around and kind of go, oh, I've just saved a bunch of money here, I'm just going to go and spend it over there. Is that okay?
I think if you ask my boss about my approach, I'm quite a monster when it comes to budgets, only because I need to know, right? So I think I'm always open to have that discussion around, an underspend, for example, in a certain area, and can that be repurposed? Generally speaking, I will have a context, a much broader view of what the entire event is looking like in terms of cost. And sometimes it's important to have that dialogue around, if we've made a saving over here, can it just be repurposed within that area, or does it need to be spent on something that maybe the agency doesn't have a visibility of, or another agency might not have a visibility of? And this, again, is where the partnership piece comes in, because unless there's those clear lines of communication, not necessarily having to share cost, but just from the centre having that umbrella view of what's going on and where value will be added potentially with additional spend, or where you won't add any value with additional spend, then at least you have that view of whether you can rob Peter to pay Paul or not.
Yeah. Now, Jane, going back to you wear these two hats. You have the headspace, so in there you're, I guess, trying to get as lower budget or as smaller budget as you can for your events. But then at Rise at 5, you're an agency kind of setup, right? But there's something quite peculiar about Rise at 5, right? It's not just a normal agency setup. In a lot of agencies, the more you spend, the more commission you get, or the more budget you can keep for yourself, right? But that's not what you're doing. Explain that and tell us why.
Yeah, it's slightly different. So I saw a few kind of big trends coming together before COVID, during COVID, and since. I think we've got the financial pressures. Obviously, budgets are under much more scrutiny than they've been before. You've got some cultural changes in terms of talent and how people want to work. Not everybody wants to come to the office 5 days a week anymore. Not everybody can because of their other personal responsibilities. You don't get the best out of people. So there's been a massive increase in the number of freelancers, for example, where they're taking their specialist skills and then working across different opportunities. And the third one is around time. I think, and we talked a little about this before, within event teams, whether you're agency or corporate, there are fewer of you because the money's not there to pay for you. So you've got much more to do with much less time. So you bring all of that together and it just kind of creates it's a big old squeeze. So yeah, the Rise at 5 model was essentially designed to connect this independent talent to corporates in a way that is managed, so that you don't have the pressure of managing lots more suppliers, lots more people. Kind of procurement teams really actively dislike it, I know. But you also can tap into some of the savings that you can get from using freelancers that don't have the overheads of some of the more traditional agencies.
Okay. And the way you deal with budgets, is there any particular difference?
Fully transparent,
Okay.
fully open book. I think from my experience, I've worked in organisations that have budgeted in different ways. You know, some will mark stuff up, some is visible markups, some is not visible markups, some will be a management fee, some is fees, some use freelancers and still charge you the same fee that they would charge for a full-time headcount when they don't have the same cost. So there's lots of different models. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily always offer the right value. There are lots of really great agencies out there. There are some changes in the market that I think could be managed differently, and that's why I've put this model together.
So Claire, going back to you, I mean, what's really happening out there, like in your role? We've mentioned all these kind of potential reasons, cost of living, COVID, still kind of the impact of that. Suppliers need to pay their staff, they need to make money, those prices are going up.
Yeah.
What's really, like, do you have an idea of how much budgets are really going up and what is the biggest pressure that's causing that?
Oh man, I don't know whether I could say budgets are actually going up in real terms. I think the thing that we all need to remember is whilst it feels like inflation is down, it's still inflation. So costs are still going up just at a lesser rate, and therefore when we had inflation sort of 12 to 18 months ago of close on 10 and over 10%, and depending on where you were in the world, you know, it was more than that. Those costs have now gone up by that much forever, you know, and now we're still seeing 2, 3, 4% going on top of those. So costs are still rising. COVID is still a thing, I think, definitely from my previous experiences, especially I've experienced in the US where it's just been impossible to recruit really good staff, especially within venues, but some vendors, suppliers as well, and so they're trying to do more with less and find the talent, and the talent that is out there is obviously charging as well because they have costs to cover. So I think we've got to this point now where we have a perfect storm of costs have risen, don't seem to be coming down anytime soon. We're working with lead times now that I think the dynamic around lead times has changed in terms of bookings quite significantly since the pandemic, because as we all came back there was this kind of hurry to book stuff when we realised that the world was actually going to stay open again. And that's put people on the back foot a little bit, and I think we're still feeling that working through the system. And then, obviously, I think with various geopolitical issues as well that are ongoing, we're not going to see any costs coming down anytime soon. So I do think there are a number of factors at play, and whilst it feels like the world should be, you know, we should be coming back to some semblance of normality, especially post-COVID, that's going to take a long time to right itself.
Yeah, it sounds great that we're able to do events as we did before COVID,
Absolutely.
but it feels like there's a kind of after effect, price to pay. We talked. Go ahead, Jen.
I was going to say, there's definitely more from the survey results. There's a bellwether report that comes out every quarter that's produced by Purchasing Managers Index. There's certainly an increase over the last few years since we returned back from the lockdowns that showed that events were much more in demand from marketing directors. It's a kind of an annual or a quarterly summary of where marketing directors are allocating budgets between different marketing channels. And events has been at the top of the growth markets for some time. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is more money overall. Absolutely. It's just being, again, Peter and Paul conversations. Well, it gets moved from one channel to another.
And it's a seller's market to a degree as well, right? Because I think there is now a real acceptance that we kind of muddled through a little bit through COVID, and we all did our very best to try and make the virtual thing work. But then I remember the first event I did back in a room with real 3D people and real tea and coffee, and just the joy, like the actual joy you could see on people's faces. It was an annual event and people pick up a coffee and there were tears in the room because people genuinely didn't know whether they were going to get back to this particular state. And that means for those who put on events, that's almost like a seller's market, because we need those services and we need to be able to run events. And we've got to a stage where, it's very difficult to drive costs down as much as we used to be able to.
Yep. When we were talking about this session, we talked also about repitching every year. This idea that there was a kind of business continuity, that things were sort of in place, and then with COVID and with the disruptions, there's a sort of a need to repitch every year. Can you just explain why you think that's happening and how the impact of that?
I think for a period after COVID, there was definitely a sense of some quite short-termism when it came to planning. I think there was a genuine spook in the market around planning too far ahead. I think a lot of venues, and some vendors, suppliers to a degree, but a lot of venues were caught out because they had taken bookings pre-COVID, as of course you do, 3, 4, 5 years in advance. Then were finding that actually they didn't know whether they were going to be able to honour those bookings, and were faced with a huge amount of refund, cancellations, paying back fees. And so I think that generated this sense of short-termism where now people, some corporates, are only really willing to work on that year-by-year cycle. I know there are certain industries that do work on a longer planning cycle. Associations as well tend to work on a 3 to 5 year planning cycle, but I think budgets are set annually. We certainly, in all the corporates I've ever worked in, have never had a marketing budget 3 years out. I get my annual marketing budget, and therefore that kind of engenders that year-over-year planning. And I think that's the hand that we're now dealt.
Okay. So let's jump in solutions, if we can, or if we can have any solutions, because it is a complex topic. Is it about finding budget line items that you can kind of squeeze more? Like, is it hotels, flights, venues, AV, F&B? I mean, we did a session on event budgets at IMEX America just a few months ago, and the room essentially started talking about AV and how expensive AV is and how they want to just cut the AV budget. Is that a fair way to do it, to just go through kind of the bigger line items and try to squeeze them there? Maybe Jane, any thoughts there?
My take on it would always...
No pressure.
It's kind of a tough one, isn't it? My take would always be to take a step back and think about, what are your objectives? Why are you running the event in the first place? What do you want to achieve?
Yeah.
What do you want people to take away from the experience? Feel, think, know, do type stuff. Mm-hmm. And what's the best way to get there? And there may be a way that you can bring those people together into an experience that doesn't involve all of the standard bells and whistles, and you just do it slightly differently. Yeah. I'm seeing, again, both hats, I'm seeing a trend towards smaller, more interactive, more kind of micro events where people have a lot more specific things in common that they want to talk about, that peer-to-peer sharing. I read a really interesting stat the other day. Peers are now equally trusted compared to scientists. Like someone that that does the same thing garners the same trust as like someone super qualified in a science thing. And politicians, media, way down the list, obviously. But, it's really interesting now to see the desire for peer-to-peer sharing.
Yep.
And that doesn't necessarily always need as much of an investment in AV as we had before. So I come back to experience design and what you're trying to achieve rather than necessarily going through line by line.
Okay. Claire, any thoughts?
Yeah. And I think we talked about this before. If you're trying to reduce the budget, my experience anyway is that you're not going to do it if you go through line by line and negotiate pence off of items, regardless of how big your budget sheet or your conference or your event is. I think you have to look very strategically around what the end user experience, as you talked about, Jane, and what you want people to walk away with in terms of their experience and what matters in order to bring that experience to life. And then identify those areas of your budget sheet that actually you could reduce on or you could do away with, for example, and those which you may need to enhance. But, I mean, in terms of AV, I think you get out what you put in, essentially, and it just depends very much on the sort of show you want to run. But you definitely can't just go through line by line trying to negotiate a pence here and a pence there off of a line, because you won't reduce your budget by much that way.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to have some time for Q&A, so if you have any questions, do get them ready so we're going to jump in. But you talk about, I mean, you kind of alluded to the idea of maybe events or the same kind of events aren't always the solution. Are we the right people to kind of ask that question, and how do you process that? Because, one side is like not holding an event, on the other side is creating a very different type of event that maybe has a different type of budget. How do you manage that? Is that kind of, you need that seat at the table to be able to have that conversation? And then, are the organizations then turning to someone else for the solutions, which means you don't have a budget or maybe a job, right? It's a very difficult conversation to have. How do you manage that? Maybe start with you, Jane.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a third option. Are events the right solution at all?
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things I've taken from, again, the COVID situation and the kind of entire re-evaluation of what marketing activities can deliver is where events sit and the value that they offer. I think it's been an undervalued skill for some time. There was a lot of views around it being, jolly, it's kind of fluffy, it's on the side. Anyone can organise an event. We talked a minute ago about where does AI fit into it. In my view, it doesn't, because it can help in certain places, but we all know humans that struggle to organise events. AI's got a lot to do before it gets there. But yeah, I think there's now an understanding of event as a marketing function,
Okay.
Rather than necessarily purely a fulfillment function. That's super important too, but that's given us a seat at the table to have these conversations and to input strategically about whether events are the right format, and if they are, what should that look like? And I think in some cases that allows us then to argue for more budget.
Okay.
Do we need a seat at the table? Yes, absolutely, but that's probably another hour's worth of at some point. Do we need to be honest as event leads as to what value is derived from our events? Yes, absolutely. And do we need to be able to call out when we think we're being asked to do something that doesn't add to the value chain in terms of experience and impact? Yes, absolutely. And I think being in the position that we're in, we need to be seen as trusted advisors. And when you are a trusted advisor, you should be able to walk into a room or have a seat at the table that challenges whether it's the fact that you think you need more budget or whether it's the fact that actually you think that maybe doing event X would be better served by doing something else Y. And then in the longer term, being able to build on that to do something else potentially from an events perspective. That's where we bring the value, and not just from the delivery perspective and churning out against a budget.
Yeah.
I think it's taking a far more strategic view and a far less tactical view of how we utilise our events budgets.
Yes. Okay. I think that's fair points. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a few more questions. Do we have any arms? Any hands? No takers for now. Okay. Maybe we'll spur some more conversations. You mentioned about getting more budget. How does that work? Is that something you've been successful at, and can you spill the beans?
On and off. I mean, I think in terms of more budget, you have to show value, and I think it feels like this conversation keeps coming back to what is the value derived, what's the impact, and if you can prove the impact and the value, then I think the conversation around budget and being able to pitch for more budget is built for you. If you go into a room, especially from a corporate perspective, where marketing budgets, generally speaking, are being determined around about now in the financial year, and just say, I just need 10% more because I'll be able to do more with it, that's not going to help your argument. I think being able to build a business case, we're event strategists, and so if we can build a business case to build on the event experience and demonstrate anticipated return for the attendees or for the business out of that budget increase, that's the first step, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's where agencies should certainly be able to work in partnership. The job of a good agency is to help you build that business case, and to find ways that support the objectives that you share, rather than necessarily looking after individual interests.
Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about making a business case. I know you're big on metrics, Jane. What metrics should we be looking at? We're going to build a business case. We want to kind of get more budget, or we want to at least demonstrate our value. And let's say we stay under the realm of marketing, right? What are the absolute metrics that we need to be able to put in a one-page proposal where the C-level wants to look at it and go, okay, I get this? Yeah,
and it really comes back to, we keep saying the same stuff, comes back to your strategy and what your objectives are. Why are you running the event in the first place? From a Headspace perspective, I'm still measured on leads, MQLs, SQOs, sales. Ultimately, that pipeline and the impact that events and delivering content, whether it helps build awareness or consideration or driving through to purchase, all of that stuff needs to contribute to your financial deliverables at the end of the year. Budgets often now, they get set annually, they get reviewed quarterly.
Yeah.
So there are opportunities to go back and ask for a bit more, but there's also times where people come to you and say, I need that back. And you're like, oh no.
But I do think that when that happens, and if you know that there's scope there to give some of that back, we never want to, but that's the honest conversation I was talking about when you're around a table. If someone comes to you and says, you know, we're doing our quarterly budget review, and can we have a bit of that? It's like, well, yes, actually, because further down the line, I might need some over here. So it's a grown-up strategic conversation about if you take that bit there, can we bear that in mind for longer term? So there is a degree of give and take there as well.
I agree. I think that buys you credibility as well. When you're having that strategic conversation, you have to be able to see a bigger picture in it.
100%.
I have to point out that we've said that it's very hard to prove the value of events.
Yeah.
And now we're saying you're going to be measured on sales, which kind of are on opposite ends of the scale. I heard one metric recently, and I don't know if this is something that you use, which is cost per touch.
That's interesting.
So how much does it cost to actually just connect with a potential client? Is that something that makes sense when you have that seat at the table to put in front of the C-level?
Potentially. I mean, we're not measured on sales. I think a lot of corporate events are around relationship building, long-term pipe.
But the touch kind of element could play a factor there.
Feed into that. So a lot of the corporates I've worked for, you may have a sales pipe of up to 2 to 3 years. So it's very difficult to say that event that I hosted meant that you were able to do that deal with client Y. But the touch element and the sort of the return on engagement as opposed to the return on investment, that's where that comes in. And I think it's being able to look at the event feedback holistically to understand what role that might have played within the longer pipe. And you tend to get a sense of the trend if you're hosting successful events, running successful events, you will see that trend out over time. But no, you can't put a pin in it and say that's because I did that.
Yeah, a tough one. There's a question, I think, over there, if you don't mind. There's a yes.
Can you see me? Yes,
we can.
Got a microphone coming to you, right there.
Hello. Thank you very much. So, Mark, you mentioned about the budgets and annual budgets. Where does sourcing event technology come into those budgets, particularly around sourcing technology that's going to save time rather than delivering value in measuring ROI? How do you source that? Where does that come in your annual budget cycle? And if you have to create a business case for that, how do you go about doing that?
Can you just say your name and your company?
Oh, sorry, it's Katie Watley. I'm CMO at FAIR.
Do you want to start and then I'll...
Sure. I need to, from, again, corporate role, I need to make a business case for any tech that needs to go into the tech stack. I also then need to make a case for marketing operations support to help integrate all of that stuff. In general, if you can make a good enough case for it, then there's interest in it. So we've just onboarded a multi-touch attribution system that links to all of that stuff. So to your point, the cost of touch points, you can start to assess it. And yeah, I think, you know, you have to make the case for it, and then you look at the results and you can see whether it's worth continuing. There's some, I'm floating a lot of things as pilots at the moment. I love a pilot. Let's test it for 3 months and see. And then often you can work with a supplier that wants your business long term, and you do a deal for, you know, supply for a short period of time. You might not necessarily integrate it fully at that point. You might then look at how that comes later, but you can certainly get enough value out of it to demonstrate the potential benefit to the business down the line.
I think the challenge with event tech is generally when you're onboarding tech, it's not an annual process, right? So you're going to onboard a tech that might be a 3-year contract or a 5-year contract. And we all know that there's going to be a period where you may well be running 2 techs that do the same because you're having to offboard one and onboard the other. So it's being able to demonstrate what your onboarding costs are. And to Jane's point, you're probably going to have resource associated with onboarding costs because you need to do training, and you may well lose productivity, frontline operations, because you're having to train people and it takes them longer. So as long as I think you can build all of that into your business case and then demonstrate what that then returns in years 2, 3, and 4, whatever it might be of the contract, then that should help in building your business case as well. And generally speaking, I found once you've got contracts on board, then obviously your cost is amortized over the number of the years of the contract. So sometimes it can look like a really scary number because you're having to commit to a 3-year contract, but it's actually a 3-year contract over 3 years as opposed to like a 1-year figure. So there's a number of different elements that would play into that.
Okay. Oh, there's 2 more questions. We're just on time, but are they quick questions? No, it's a long question. Do you mind speaking? Quick question, maybe? Okay, one quick question here. Lewis.
Thank you. Lewis Manson from Inviso, organizer of capital markets conferences. Just wondering, from more of a corporate lens, when you look at event strategy and what you want to get out of sort of return on investment, and then looking at budget considerations, what factors would you look at when using sort of an internal team to deliver something, using an agency to deliver something, or sponsoring sort of an external industry-wide event?
That's a great question. I think you have to, when you're looking at utilising agency resource versus your in-house team, you have to look at the resource you've already got in-house and the skill sets you've already got in-house, and do a really thorough assessment of your skill sets and your physical resource. How many hours have you got in front of you that can deliver the programme that you're trying to deliver, and whether that provides return. And then looking at your agency, and most organisations will work with a suite of agencies, not just 1 or 2 agencies, is understanding how they can complement the in-house resource that you've got. And then ideally, you should be looking to do exactly that, to look at what your resource is and look to how you would complement that in terms of your agencies. Is it actually easier in the short term and potentially cheaper in the long term to hire in, although there are costs associated with recruitment, obviously, we all know can be higher than it would be to lean on agencies at the outset. But also look across sort of your entire skill pool, if you like, once you've assessed whether it's easier to bring on agencies or to do that in-house. My experience is that sponsoring third-party events will give you short-term return, but will rarely enable you to build that institutional knowledge. Either with agencies can build institutional knowledge of your firm just as much as your internal resource can, that you can leverage year on year. You sometimes will, but quite often won't necessarily get that return if you are sponsoring a third-party event.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for being here, and hopefully you enjoyed the session.